It's a great pleasure to have with us Professor Greco from St. Louis University. If you don't follow the literature in mainstream epistemology, John is mainly known for his version of epistemology, the constant agent reliabilism. And his talk today, knowledge solution abilities, is about the central aspects of his work. And I think it's going to be quite exciting, as he will probably be arguing against more than just one people in this room.
So thanks. This is a great opportunity for me to be among people I consider to be friends. I hope the feeling's mutual, and people who plenty of people here in the room that I've spent a lot of time reading and talking with and thinking about. So this is definitely the place to give this talk. A little background. Actually, to get the background, I think it might be good just to refer to the abstract here. So robust virtue epistemology, and that I think that's Duncan Pritchard's phrase, holds that knowledge is true belief from cognitive ability, and that ability, the ability condition on knowledge, entails a safety condition, or entails a condition that guarantees knowledge to be in a way sufficiently immune from luck. Now my version relativizes abilities to environments, and Ernest Sosa's version does not. And then Pritchard's modest virtue epistemology also requires that true belief from cognitive ability for knowledge, but adds an independent safety condition. So for Duncan, it's not just that knowledge is from virtue and virtue entails safety, but that knowledge is from virtue, but then you have to add and is also safe belief. And when you put those conditions together, you get the condition sufficient for knowledge. So for a long time, I've been trying to figure out, who's right on this particular issue. And I started to think, well, maybe this is just verbal, because we all think that you need virtue. We all think that virtues are manifested in an environment under certain conditions. We all think that you need safety. The way Duncan's thinking about virtue, success from ability does not really, or success from virtue doesn't really entail safety, so you have to add it. The way Ernie and I are thinking about it, Ernie Sosa and I are thinking about it does. But maybe, that's just because Duncan's defining virtue or ability differently, and so if you just got all the bookkeeping correct, maybe this is just verbal. But then I started to think, well, maybe it's not just verbal, because here's another place where we all agree. We all agree that the value of knowledge is to be understood in terms of knowledge being a kind of success from virtue or success from ability. So the idea is that success from virtue, or virtuous success due to my own excellent agency, that we value more than mere success or mere lucky success. And that's across the board. So whether you're in sports or in academia or some other kind of an intellectual endeavor, artistic, whatever, we tend to value success from our own abilities, our own able agency, more than we value just mere lucky success. And so we're all understanding the value of knowledge in those terms. That the knowledge is better than mere lucky true belief, because it's an instance of true belief from virtue or ability, as opposed to just merely lucky true belief. Okay, but then if we're thinking about abilities differently, and if we're thinking about success from ability differently, now we have to ask, well, what kind of success from ability gives knowledge its value? And so it ends up not being a merely verbal dispute, but a dispute over, what's the seat of value? Where is the value of knowledge coming from? Well, it comes from success from ability, but then if you have different ways of understanding success from ability, you're going to have different understandings of that seat of the value of knowledge. So that's basically what this paper is about. I'm going to try to argue that my way of looking at things is actually the better way to do it from a value of knowledge perspective. Okay. By the way, how long should I talk?
You may talk until 4:30 if you like, but
okay. 4:30 at the most.
Hours,
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. Okay. So again, I'm defending the view, what Duncan calls robust virtue epistemology. By the way, I'm going to focus both on my view and on Duncan's view because we're here. Ernie's not. If Ernie had showed up, we'd talk more about him. But maybe in Q&A, if people are trying to get straight on what Souza's view is here vis-a-vis these questions, then we could try to do that in Q&A. Okay. Okay. So the view I'm going to defend is that knowledge is true belief from cognitive ability or cognitive virtue or cognitive excellence, however you want to think of it. So S knows that P just in case S has a true belief that P, rather than a false belief or no belief at all, because S's belief was produced or sustained by cognitive ability. So now, modest virtue epistemology or anti-luck virtue epistemology, as Duncan sometimes puts it, agrees with that first condition, but then thinks you have to add a second safety condition. Now again, I agree that knowledge has to be safe as well as virtuous, but I think that you don't need to add that second clause because it just falls out of the virtue condition. Okay, we're going to see why. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to begin by looking at some alleged counterexamples to this robust view. So the first is this a standard barn facade Gettier type case. So the idea is that you're going. Suppose you're traveling through barn facade county, where there are lots of barn facades that are indistinguishable from real barns from the road. So unknown to you. So you see a barn facade, you think it's a barn. You see another barn facade, you think it's a barn. Then you see one real barn, and you think it's a barn. And then you go on, and there's more barn facades. You continue to be fooled. So now the intuition that most people have in that case is that when you look at a real barn, you don't know it's a real barn. Why? Because it could have easily been a barn facade, right? And you're not telling the difference between the two. So now this looks like a counterexample to the robust epistemology view, because it looks like when you do look at that real barn, you have a true belief that's a real barn. And the reason you have a true belief is because you're looking right at a real barn. Your perception is good. You've got a direct look at that barn, right? So it makes sense to say that your belief is produced by intellectual virtue, and the reason you have a true belief is because it's produced by this excellent perception. And yet we want to say there is no knowledge there, or at least there's strong pressure to say there's no knowledge there. So that's one of the main conditions why Duncan wants to add a safety condition, right? Because that would explain why you don't have knowledge there. Because even though your belief is produced by excellent perception, you could easily have had a false belief. In fact, 30 seconds ago you did have a false belief. 30 seconds from now, when you go by a barn facade, you will have another false belief, right? So barn facade looks like it is a good favor it's a good case in favor of the modest version that Duncan wants to defend. Same thing with the Archie case. So Archie selects a target at random and skillfully fires at this target and successfully hits it because of his skill. He's an archer. He's firing an arrow at a target. On the account of achievement on the table, this is genuine achievement. because he had success, and the success is because of his archery ability. Suppose, however, that unbeknownst to Archie, there is a force field around each of the other targets, such that had he aimed at one of these targets, he would have missed. Okay? So Duncan Pritchard comments, it is thus a matter of luck that he is successful in the sense that he could easily have not been successful. Notice, however, that luck of this sort does not seem to undermine the thesis that Archie's success is a genuine achievement. Indeed, he would still ascribe an achievement to Archie in this case, even despite the luck involved. It is, after all, because of his skill that he is successful, even though he could very easily not have been successful in this case. So again, it looks like you need two conditions. The success is because of skill or because of ability, but also it's safe. Easily could he have failed, okay? And that's what's wrong with the Archie case. So now the reasoning goes like this. The Archie case involving the force field around archery targets is analogous to the barn facade case in all relevant respects. Now, the Archie case is success from ability, but since they're analogous, we have to conclude that the barn facade case is also success from ability. There's no knowledge in the barn facade case, and therefore the barn facade case, which is a case of success from ability or cognitive achievement, is a case of success from ability without knowledge. And so again, this is all towards the argument that you have to add something to get knowledge, and it's going to be some kind of anti-luck condition. That's Duncan's safety condition. Okay. All right, well, I want to give you a couple of other examples. This is from Cholesterin and Pritchard, a paper where they give some epistemic twin earth examples. So on Earth, you've got your local environment, which is full of water. And then if you spread out not just your local environment, which is like what you're perceptually interacting with, but your more regional environment, you've still got water. And then if you just go global to include, out as far as you want to go, you've still got, it's all water on Earth, okay? Now, on epistemic twin Earth, you're perceptually interacting with water on your local environment, but in the regional environment, just beyond what you're perceptually interacting with, you've got lots of stuff that looks just like water, but it's not water, it's XYZ, it's a completely different kind of thing. But in the global environment, more broadly, that you grew up with and that your abilities were trained up on, etc., that was all water, okay? So now what this case is designed to, well, first of all, the intuition is that when you're in your local environment and you see H2O and you perceive H2O, you perceive H2O and you say, okay, that's water. That is success from ability because you've got this ability to identify water in your global environment and presumably still in your local environment as well. But you could have easily been looking at XYZ because the XYZ is just right beyond the stuff that you're perceptually interacting with. So again, this is yet another case where it looks like, look, you've got success from ability, but it's not knowledge because you could have easily been wrong, and knowledge can't be lucky like that. Okay. So you might think that Cholesterin and Pritchard are beating a dead horse at this point, but here's another example. Actually, let me try to comment on the theme that's running through these examples that Pritchard and then Cholesterin and Pritchard are trying to exploit. Okay, the theme is that, look, your abilities are what they are, and when you go from one environment to another, you don't lose your abilities, you retain your abilities, And when you exercise your ability in one environment, you're exercising the same ability when you take it to another environment, right? In some environments, under some conditions, that exercise of ability is going to give you a very reliable access at the truth or at some other kind of success that you're aiming for. But in other environments, that very same ability is not going to be very reliable because of something of the environment. So even if you happen to be successful, even if you happen to, for example, form a true belief in the epistemic case, you could have easily gone wrong. It could have just been a lucky success. So really what you need for knowledge, you do need this success from ability, but it can't be just success from ability. It's got to be success from ability that's sufficiently not lucky success. And so you need to add this safety condition. So the moral of the story that these people are trying to draw is that success from ability alone does not entail safety. Safety is a different issue that you have to add on. And it's only when you got both of these things that you have knowledge. Okay. So actually, you know what? You get the idea. All right. So now, on my view, what you take with it's a little tricky how I got to put this, but on my view, what you take with you from one environment to another or across various conditions is a kind of is a set of dispositions. And whether those dispositions count as abilities depend on the environment you're in or what conditions you're in. Okay? So for example, I want to say that I have the ability to, this is a bad example because I lost this ability, but at one point I had the ability to run a mile in, say, 10 minutes. It wasn't a great ability, but it was an ability to run a mile in 10 minutes, okay? But that was under certain conditions. Fairly flat road, good running conditions. I never had the ability to run a mile underwater, okay, in 10 minutes. And I think that abilities in general are like that. So it's just that we usually don't state the conditions because they're kind of implicit. They're given implicit by the conversational context. So for example, when I say that my 10-year-old has the ability to hit baseballs, I'm implicitly meaning, well, under the conditions that he plays baseballs, right? But plays baseball in. But if you put him in major league conditions where they're actually trying to strike you out, throw that ball fast, he doesn't have the ability to hit baseball. He's not very reliable. He wouldn't be very reliable at successfully hitting those baseballs. Now you take the best hitter in the major leagues, they do not have the ability to hit baseballs in the dark, right? When you say that, say, Babe Ruth was a great hitter, you mean under typical baseball conditions, not at night or in a hurricane or something like that, okay? So on Duncan's view, an ability is what it is. Whether it's reliable at achieving the relevant success depends on the conditions of the environment. On my view, abilities are relative to environments. So it would make the sense to say, well, you have an ability to do X relative to this environment, not this environment. So for example, on the barn facade case, I would say you usually have the ability to tell that something's a barn just by perception, but in barn facade county you don't, because that's a bad environment for your ability. So you don't have an ability to discriminate barns from non-barns in barn facade county, and so your belief isn't a success from ability there in barn facade county. Whereas on Duncan's view, no, you've got the same ability. It's a success from ability, but it's not reliable. Okay. So now again, you might start to think, well, this is just verbal. He's thinking of abilities one way, I'm thinking of them a different way, but either way, we're going to agree that you don't know in barn facade county, and you do know when there's no barn facades around, right? Nobody disagrees about, whether the kid can hit the baseball in little league conditions or major league conditions. So like, this is just verbal, right? So here's my pitch now that it's not just verbal. Again, we're saying that knowledge is valuable because it's a kind of success from ability. Now, how are you going to read that success from ability? How are you going to read that success from ability locution? Are you going to read it in the way that I attributed to Duncan, or are you going to read it in the way I attributed to me? Where's the seat of value there? Does it reside in success from ability understood one way, or does it reside in success from ability understood the other way? So that's why I think this is a substantive question and not merely verbal. So now we get a strategy for understanding, for getting the anti-luck condition on knowledge right, okay? So the first step is to juxtapose knowledge undermining luck to virtuous, able, competent agency. So the governing idea is that knowledge is opposed to luck in just the way that virtuous success or able success in general is opposed to luck. Now the second step is to get the ability condition right. We want it to come out that success from ability entails the same kind of immunity from luck that is required for knowledge. Okay. So this second step involves what I'll call getting the parameters right. That is, correctly characterizing the parameters in terms of which knowledge-producing abilities are to be defined. Okay, in terms of which knowledge-producing abilities are to be defined. Okay. Now, I'm going to adopt some terminology from Ernest Sosa at this point. So Sosa thinks that an ability is an inner disposition to produce some result with enough reliability when in appropriate shape and situation. That gives us a nice way of making some distinctions. So Sosa is now making a distinction between sort of the inner disposition you have. Let's say it's like, your skin inward physical dispositions. The shape you're in. So for example, are you drunk? Are you sick? Are you suffering from vertigo? Something like that. Are you sleeping or awake? And then the situation you're in. Are you in a hurricane? Are you in normal lighting conditions? Are you in, the external situation, right? And then we can think of abilities along these different dimensions. So one thing you might mean by an ability is just the inner disposition. That's where the ability is. Another way you might think of abilities is, abilities they supervene on the inner disposition plus the shape, right? And then another way you might think of it is, abilities have to be understood in terms of the inner disposition, shape, and the external situation, okay? And so it looks like Duncan is thinking of abilities as just supervening on inner disposition alone. I'm understanding them as supervening on inner disposition plus shape plus situation. Okay? Maybe Duncan's thinking of it as supervening on inner disposition plus shape. I'm not sure, but it seems like he's not thinking of it as the external conditions missing, individuating abilities. Okay? Now, we're now talking about appropriate shape and situation, right? Now, there are various theoretical options there. So, when we talk about appropriate conditions or appropriate situation or shape, do we mean what's normal? Do we mean, for example, what's normal for the species? Do we mean what's typical for this individual? Should we refer back to like developmental history or evolutionary history to pick out normal or appropriate conditions? Should we do it by identifying some ability domain, like the conditions normal for baseball or for perception or something like that? Should we think of a practical context? So we might say, well, for a little leaguer versus for somebody who's going to make, we're thinking of offering $1 million contract to, right? So so everybody thinks that, look, you have to think of abilities as being exercised in appropriate conditions, in appropriate shape, et cetera, but there are all these theoretical options about how to understand that appropriateness, right? So I personally opt for practical context. I think that when we're talking about what kind of ability somebody has, we have some kind of practical tasks in mind. So for example, getting a hit in Little League, or getting a hit at the major league level, or distinguishing barns from non-barns in Idaho versus doing it in Barn Facade County or something like that, right? Where you might have different practical tasks at hand. For the purpose of this paper, we don't have to make any decisions here. I opt for a practical context, but there's no knockdown argument here. I think the correct choice will be a function of getting the extension right, making your cases come out right, but also other constraints such as knowledge-action relation, assertion relations, practical reasoning, value of knowledge considerations, etc. But I think for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, I think the points I want to make here about the value of knowledge are not, it's not going to matter. Okay. So now, here's a proposal for the kind of robust theory I want to defend. So I want to say S has a knowledge-relevant ability, where abilities... so S has a knowledge-relevant ability relative to an environment E. Is going to be understood this way. S has an inner disposition D to believe truths in some range of propositions. So, for example, perceptual abilities are going to be different from reasoning abilities or memory abilities, etc. When in a range of conditions, and then with a degree of reliability T when in E. So we've identified various parameters in virtue of which we have to understand a knowledge-relevant ability. So in other words, S has a knowledge-relevant ability relative to environment E means that S has an inner disposition D to believe truths in an appropriate range of propositions when in an appropriate range of conditions and with an appropriate degree of reliability when in E. Okay. So how do we understand appropriate? How do we understand those parameters? Again, that's a matter of theory choice. Some people are going to refer to what's normal. Some people are going to refer to what's typical. Some people are going to refer to some domain activity. Some are going to refer to a practical context. What's nice for our purposes is that in almost all cases, normal, typical, relevant domain of activity, practical context, they all give you the same results. So it doesn't matter what your theory choice is there at that, at that decision point, because for most cases it's just going to be the same, same extension. Okay. You get into problems when kind of like the fringe cases, and that's where you're going to make your decisions. Okay. But however we fill in that way, we're going to have the following schema. Okay. So here's what I want to emphasize. We've got to do two things. We've got to define knowledge-relevant ability. That's one of our tasks. And I'm doing it in such a way to make abilities relative to an environment. Okay? And then, after that task of being explicit about how you're going to understand a knowledge-relevant ability, that then puts you in a position to give you conditions for knowledge, okay? So now the conditions for knowledge are S knows that P, if and only if, for some such ability and some such environment, P is in that range of propositions that the ability gives you access to. S is actually in the appropriate conditions and in the appropriate environment. And S's belief that P is produced by an exercise of the ability while in E. That's in Souza's terminology, the belief is competently formed. And then finally, S's belief that P is true because, not just that it is produced, not that it is true, but it's true because it's produced by an exercise of the ability in the environment. So in Souza's terminology, S's belief is true because competent, or as Souza would say, S's belief is apt. True because, not just true, not just competent, but true because competent, and so apt. Okay. Alternatively, you get a different statement of the same conditions. S knows that P, if and only if, for some appropriate inner disposition, range of propositions, conditions, degree of reliability, and environment, P is in that range, S is in the conditions while in the environment, and then S's belief that P is, with degree T of reliability, produced by an exercise of the disposition in the conditions in the environment. And not only that, but S's belief is true because it is so produced. Okay, so that's the conditions of knowledge that you get when you define success from ability and epistemic ability or knowledge producing ability in the way that I do. Now you'll notice that in those conditions we just saw, condition 4 entails conditions 1 through 3. In other words, the idea that your true belief is true because produced by ability, that entails that your belief is true. It entails that it was produced by ability. It entails that, the way I'm reading it, entails that you were in the appropriate conditions, etc. Okay. So really, we could just collapse that whole thing and say S knows that P, if and only if, for some appropriate ability, S's belief that P is true because it is produced by an exercise of that ability in the environment. Okay. Okay. Now, here's the important point. If you're thinking of it that way, the ability condition is going to entail a certain kind of safety condition. Okay? Success from ability will entail that S's belief is what we're going to call triple S safe, which means just that not easily would S believe P while retaining her inner disposition and in appropriate conditions, and yet P be false. Okay. In other words, in close possible worlds where S is in the right conditions, almost always when S believes that P will be true. And in fact, to degree T with a certain degree of reliability. Okay. So that's important because what I'm trying to argue here is that the ability condition, conceived the way I want to conceive it, entails a safety condition. It doesn't entail outright safety. It contains a kind of relative safety. So in other words, the idea of this relative safety is this. It doesn't guarantee that you couldn't easily be wrong. It guarantees that you couldn't easily be wrong while you have the same inner dispositions, you're in the same shape, and you're in the same conditions and in the same broader environment. Okay? So let me give you an example of this. Let's say Babe Ruth is playing, let's say Derek Jeter is playing a night game and the field is well lit, so it's good, normal lighting conditions, and he successfully hits a home run. Okay? Now, in a kind of absolute sense, he could have easily missed. Because let's say there was somebody with their hands on the switch that could have easily turned off the lights just as the pitch was thrown. And if he had turned off the lights, Jeter would have missed altogether. So Jeter could have easily missed, right? Because this person could have easily turned off the lights. But the point is that would be sort of irrelevant for evaluating whether Jeter's success was from ability, because the way we're thinking of success from ability is that it's success under the relevant conditions, in the relevant environment, while in the relevant shape. Suppose Jeter could have easily been drunk or easily been drugged out because he took a sip from one glass of water a few minutes earlier. If he had sipped the other glass of water, which was drugged, he would be like flat on he'd be hardly able to see. And he would have easily missed. But that doesn't matter, because we're evaluating for the shape that he's in the conditions that he's actually in, et cetera, okay? So it's true that he could have easily missed. He could have easily been drugged. The lights could have been easily off. But it's not true that he could have easily missed while in the same shape, while under the same conditions, et cetera, okay? So again, it's SSS relative safety. So long as you have the first S is for inner seat of the disposition, the second S is for shape, and the third S is for situation. So it's SSS relative safety. As long as you retain those things, you're in shape. Okay. If you like possible world semantics, think of it this way. Think of a set of possible worlds centered on the actual world. Now, absolute safety the way you get the logical space it's in terms of absolute closeness. There's just some sort of absolute closeness. And to say that a belief is absolutely safe is to say that not easily could it be false, which is to say that it's not going to be false in any close possible worlds. Okay. S relative safety gives you a different set of logical space. You're going to only be evaluating possible worlds where you've got the same inner dispositions, the same shape, the same situation, you're in the same broader environment. So it's not just that the worlds are absolutely close, they're relevantly close. And the only worlds that are relevantly close are the ones where basically they're SSS worlds. They're worlds in which these conditions are satisfied. And then you evaluate for, how often are you successful, or how often do you fail in that set of relevantly close possible worlds. That gives you SSS relative safety. Okay. So S's belief is SSS safe relative to an environment means that within the space of worlds constituted by the environment, not easily would S believe P while retaining D in condition C when P is false. Okay. Throughout the space of possible worlds constituted by the modal environment, where S is in C while retaining D, almost always when S believes that P is true. So now we can return to our examples and see how our view does on these examples. So in bar facade, when you're going through barn facade counting, and you've got lots of barn facades that you can't distinguish from real barns, from the road anyway, do you know when you're looking at the one real barn? And on this view, the answer is going to be no, you don't know. Because your perceptual dispositions, although they're highly reliable in normal conditions, you're not in normal conditions. You're in Barn-Facade County. And so when you evaluate through that space of possible worlds, you're going to find lots of places where you form a false belief in the conditions that you're actually in. So you just a little, down the road, you're falsely believing there's a farm. Just a little up the road, you're falsely believing that there's a barn, right? So I think that once you see the conditions spelled out this way, you can see that you actually don't have an ability relative to the conditions you're in, the environment you're in Barn-Facade County, and so you don't fulfill the...
So you think 3 is violated?
Right. Both 3 and 4 end up not being satisfied here because there's again, you have a knowledge relevant ability relative to environment only when you have success with an appropriate degree of reliability. That's what you don't have. You don't have an ability you have perceptual abilities relative to normal conditions and normal environments, but you don't have a perceptual ability relative to Barn-Facade County. Okay, that's the way it falls out here. Okay, but we'll now we're not right now. I'm not so much concerned with whether this is the right way to do it. I'm really concerned with just saying how this way of doing it works. Okay. Okay. Now take the Archie example. I think plausibly, if you're evaluating for archery success, shooting at a target with a force field is like swinging at a pitch with the lights out. It's just irrelevant for evaluating for this kind of success. And so I think we would attribute success from ability or achievement to Archie precisely because if you evaluate only under archery relevant conditions, which exclude the conditions in which you're shooting at a force field protected target, Archie does have high reliability with respect to hitting the targets, and so it's going to count as a success from ability. And it's going to be true that in an SSS relative sense, not easily would Archie have been wrong. In other words, would Archie have missed the target? In other words, not easily would he have missed, so long as he's under archery relevant conditions. And when you're shooting at a target with a force field, that's just not archery relevant conditions. It's like Jeter swinging with the lights out. Okay. Consider a modified Archie case. Imagine a sport called Archery Star, where the goal of the contest is to first identify a good target and then shoot it. Now, suppose Archie lacks the ability to find good targets, but picks out a good target by luck and shoots it with skill. Or suppose he is properly skilled but running out of time, and so he just has to randomly pick out a target, which luckily for him is a good one, and then he shoots it. Now, if you were evaluating Archery Star abilities, maybe like part of the game is you have to be able to figure out where the force fields are, right? If you were evaluating for whether this was a success from an Archery Star relevant ability, now you would have to include the worlds where he's shooting at a force field protected target, and as it turns out, he wouldn't be shooting from ability because he lacks the ability to distinguish good targets from bad targets, which is part of what goes into having Archery Star abilities as opposed to having just plain old archery abilities. So I think this is just again, it's an argument that if you've got your conditions straight for success from ability, plausibly the way we're doing it is it's getting our cases right. Okay. In the twin Earth case, I think that we have to fill in the case a little better than with a little more detail than Cholesterin and Duncan do. So if the relevant environment is just the local environment, it's going to end up that S's belief that true belief that there's water is success from ability, and it's safe within this local environment. If the relevant environment is going to include the XYZ close by, then it's not going to be safe, and it's not going to be a success from ability. So you really have to make these decisions about whether the world in which S is in the XYZ region are close enough worlds to evaluate. And that's going to depend on decisions about how you're fixing those parameters we were talking about. Okay. All right, so that's one way of doing it. Here's another way of doing it. So on Pritchard's account, because remember the way that this talk is going, right? I'm giving two ways of doing it. And then we're going to ask which way is going to hook up with our arguments about the value of knowledge, right? So I'm giving you one way. I just gave you one way to understand success from ability and the relationship between success from ability and knowledge. Now I'm going to give you another way. This is Pritchard's way to understand success from ability and the relation between success from ability and knowledge. And then we're going to say we're going to ask which way gives us a better account of the value of knowledge. Okay? So far, the purpose of my talk was not to say that my way is right. It's just to say here's what my way is. And now the purpose of this talk is not, the purpose of this part of the talk is not to say that Pritchard's way of doing it is wrong. It's just this is the way it is. It's only in the third part of the talk where we adjudicate, we're going to say which way makes better sense of the value of knowledge. Okay. All right. So I think Duncan is associating knowledge relevant abilities with just the inner disposition. So for him, an inner disposition D is a knowledge relevant ability means that D is an inner disposition of S to believe truths in some range with an appropriate degree of reliability when in normal conditions. Okay? So there's no talk about an ability relative to one environment, not to another environment. In fact, you don't even say you have an ability relative to normal conditions versus an ability relative to non-normal conditions. It's just that if you have a disposition that's reliable in normal conditions, that's all it is to have an ability, and no matter what conditions you're in. Okay? So here's a quote from Pritchard and Cholesterin. Abilities are relative only to the stable environment in which whoever has them is typically located. That is to say, abilities are possessed as long as they are reliably manifested in the normal circumstances in which abilities are acquired through learning and sustaining through practice. Temporary, abnormal environments cannot rob a subject of an ability that she otherwise reliably manifests in the normal run of things. So that's why, on Pritchard's account of knowledge, when you take that notion of ability, that's why you need a safety condition. So on his account, S knows that P if and only if for some inner disposition, D, S's belief that P is true in part because it is produced by an exercise of D. That's not going to guarantee reliable success. So you have to add in a safety condition to get that anti-luck condition. Okay. So in other words, in almost all close possible worlds where S is believed that P is produced by an exercise of D, P is true. So here's another way of thinking of it. The way I'm understanding success from ability, the relevant logical space in which you evaluate S's performance, the only relevant space is going to be the ones in which S is not only believing from the disposition she believed from, but she's in the same shape and she's in the same situation, she's in the same broader environment. Okay? And then it just falls out of that if she's believing from ability, she's going to believe with reliability. Okay, she's going to be SSS relative safe. Okay. The way that Duncan's doing it, the possible worlds you're evaluating here in just this first condition, all you need is the same disposition. It doesn't matter. You can vary shape, you can vary situation, you can vary the various conditions in the environment. The similarity ordering is not going to take those conditions into account. It's just going to it's going to be a more non-relative or absolute similarity ordering, and you're going to evaluate through that space. Now, if you do it that way, just the fact that you're believing from the disposition isn't going to get you safety. It's not going to get you reliability, because you might easily have been in different shape. You might easily have been in different circumstances that are nevertheless, they're close. And so that's going to bring in worlds where you're failing. And so there's no guarantee of safety or reliability just because your success is from your inner disposition. That's why you have to add a safety condition, which is that, okay, not easily would you go wrong in the close possible worlds. Just the fact that you're believing from the right kind of disposition isn't going to give you that modal result. So here's what's going on. Greco, that's me, Pritchard and Souza all define ability one way or another in terms of reliability. So they're defining ability in terms of reliability one way or another, whether it's normal conditions or whatever. However, whereas on my version, let's leave Souza out of it, on my version of robust virtue epistemology, my approach understands relevant parameters so as to guarantee that success from ability entails SSS relative safety. Pritchard's anti-luck or modest VE, virtue epistemology, his approach makes success from ability independent of reliability, and so has to add an independent safety condition. Where does Souza stand on this? I'm not really sure. We could talk about that, but getting just the two views straight is enough. Okay. So does this come down to a merely notational difference? So the argument here is that this isn't merely verbal. This is a dispute about the value of knowledge, or at least it can be seen that way. What is the seat of the value of knowledge? What kind of success from ability gives knowledge its value? So here are some options you might take. One option is that the value of knowledge comes from the wider ability condition. In other words, the success from ability condition on the wide characterization of ability that entails safety. Okay. Another option is that all value comes from the narrow ability condition, the one that doesn't entail safety. And so you have to add an anti-luck condition. So the first option is that the value of knowledge entirely resides in success from ability as I conceive it. Another option is that the value of knowledge entirely resides in the success from ability as Duncan conceives it. And then a third option is that the value of knowledge is divided between an independent narrow ability condition and a safety condition. So that, you get part of the value is from success from ability narrowly conceived, then you get added value from the added safety condition. Okay. I think it's well, I won't speculate. All right. Okay, so adjudication. So the first point I want to make by way of adjudication is that as we're talking about the value of knowledge here, it seems Pritchard's view is too strong in the following sense. Why should knowledge require success outside appropriate shape and situation, no matter how we're understanding those? In other words, why should knowledge require what we might call S relative safety as opposed to SSS relative safety? So, in other words, Duncans' safety condition basically amounts to disposition relative safety. So long as you retain the inner disposition you have, not easily could you be wrong. As opposed to SSS relative safety, so long as you maintain not only your inner disposition, but you're in the same shape, in the same circumstances, not easily could you be wrong. Okay. So why should knowledge require? So notice that S relative safety is much stronger than SSS relative safety, right? S relative safety, or inner disposition relative safety, is a very strong kind of safety. It means that not easily could you go wrong. Doesn't matter if shape varies, doesn't matter if situation varies, as long as you've got the same disposition, not easily would you go wrong. Whereas SSS relative safety is weaker. It's not easily could you go wrong so long as you maintain your disposition and the same shape and the same situation. Okay. So why should we care about that stronger kind of safety? So, for example, think of somebody who's sober but easily could be drunk. So they're in good shape, but they easily could be in terrible shape. Presumably we care about their performance when they're sober. And it doesn't matter that they could have easily been drunk and their performance would fall off the table, so to speak, right? So take Jeter, for example. Jeter could easily be drunk, but he's not. And we care about his performance in the shape that he's in, not the shape that he could easily be in. Okay, so that suggests that when we care about success from ability, we care about success from ability in the shape that the person's in. Okay. How about someone who's not in a house of mirrors but easily could be? So suppose there's this house of mirrors, and if you were in the house of mirrors, you would be terrible in terms of making judgments about people's location. You think they're in front of you when they're behind you, right? But suppose you're not in the house of mirrors. Suppose you're outside in the parking lot and you can just see clearly that somebody's in front of you. I think what we care about is that you're safe given the conditions that you're in. It doesn't matter that you could easily be wrong because you could easily be in the house of mirrors, because you're not in the house of mirrors. So again, here's an epistemic case where it seems like what matters when we're evaluating success from ability is not S relative safety, but SSS relative safety. Okay. Second point is that in general we don't value success from inner skill where that success is too lucky. So for example, consider a drunk archer in a hurricane. Okay. So the drunk archer in a hurricane fires at the target, and lo and behold, he hits it right in the bullseye. Okay, I think when we're thinking about, okay, was that the kind of success we value, or was that just lucky success? And I think we're going to say that's just lucky success. Yeah, he hit the target, but he was drunk and in a hurricane. He could have. Okay. So we don't really care about that kind of success. How about a lucky drunk driver, terrible shape, okay? The drunk driver is in terrible shape, but he doesn't hit anybody. Are we going to credit that success? Is that the kind of success we're going to value in someone? No. How about a reckless driver, somebody who might be sober but in terrible situation? Maybe it's like a hurricane. Maybe there's all kinds of, there's people with baby carriages crossing the street, and he's just like flying in and out, just reckless. The situation's terrible. He's successful. Well, do we value that kind of success from ability? I want to say no. Okay. So now, remember, I'm not imagining somebody with incredible abilities here. I'm not imagining someone with an incredible ability to hit the target reliably even when drunk and in a hurricane, or somebody who's such a good driver he can, drive well even amongst baby carriages on a wet road. I'm imagining somebody with normal abilities, but whose success is really lucky because they're in terrible shape or terrible situation. I want to say that's not the kind of success that we value. So basically, I want to juxtapose the value of lucky, and in other words, unreliable success from inner skill exercised in inappropriate situation and shape. Juxtapose that to the value of non-lucky success, so say it's reliable and safe, from inner skill exercised in appropriate situation and shape. And I want to say that's where we place the value, in general and in the case of intellectual success as well. So the moral of the story then is we value non-lucky success, but success from ability that does not entail safety is too lucky and therefore not valuable. Hence, success from Pritchard's type ability is not in and of itself valuable. Now that accords with our original strategy for getting the anti-luck condition right, and the spirit and ground of the virtue theoretic approach to the value problem. That approach understands knowledge undermining luck precisely by exploiting the distinction between lucky success and virtuous success more generally, and explains the value of knowledge accordingly. So that's where I end there.